let's rehearse a little bit where we were on Wednesday. So there was an extended discussion of unilinear cultural progression and why that's a disaster. The point of that discussion, though, is not to make you aware of the dangers of racist ideology. The point is to give you an example of how you might criticize a construct and to give some of the flavors of that. So if we were to rehearse some of the points made, Lord Acton said, actions may not be deduced from facts, although actions have a great deal to do with facts. And in the same way, this early 1700, 1800 idea about cultural differences was science of its day. We have lots and lots of brain measurements. We have lots and lots of skulls in Harvard, different ethnicities, with various measurements made to confirm racial differences and racial identities. And it fails because, generally speaking, on the empirical side, there is some evidence that cultures skip. And third variable, other side variables are not considered in explaining the data. So if, for example, you go to very primitive societies and say, oh, you know what, these people have weaker bones and smaller brains and shorter stature. This may not be genetic. It may be parasites are much more common there. Nutrition is poorer. Life expectancy is shorter. And as a result, you're seeing differences in the skeletal footprint of the person. But the empirical criticisms are not the only ones. To the extent that a construct flies in the face of ethical considerations, of basic human dignity, you might criticize the existence of the construct and look elsewhere for it. That is not the only example you can have. Looking back at American society, science in general, we have lots and lots of constructs that we have examined and shown there. Eugenics in the United States also claimed a scientific basis. More recently, within your life, the panic about craft babies is another example of a construct that didn't really exist. We had to made it a part of the whole thing. So now we're going to drill down to operational definitions, because at the end of the day, if you're going to be talking about data, you're going to have to say what data. There's a lot of ways to define things. And I talked a little bit more about even school achievement could have many different operationalizations with many different prejudices. And universities, when you applied here and you looked at what's this education at Missouri going to give you, we talked a lot in those glossy brochures about you will be able to think critically. You will be able to reason about ideas across many disciplines. Well, what specifically do you mean about critical thinking? It might surprise you, since this is kind of the area that I research. A lot of critical thinking is, can you make a deduction? Can you make a logical inference, like a mathematical inference? If P, then Q, and if not Q, then not P, those types of things. But they don't get at, are you able to reason complexly about an issue? Are you able to say, for example, school achievement has many problems. School achievement can be a nutrition problem. It can be an educational problem. It can be a family problem. It can be a social problem. And each of those areas has its own discipline in social work. And an idea about how best to deal with the system of problems that relate to achievement in school is the act of reasoning across those various contexts. Similarly, we also talk about intelligence. Well, in my life, intelligence has gone through many changes. Generally speaking, if we go back to the early models of intelligence, it was thought to be this general single ability. You were either smart or you weren't. an awful lot of the data on that construct was based on, of course, reaction times. This is because at that time, we had telegraph key operators, we had electricity, and we could measure with little clocks exactly how quickly we responded to things. And those people who were thought to be more intelligent were those who could hit a telegraph key really quick. Thank God for coffee, it makes me smart, you know? So, however, later on, we started to think more about, well, maybe there's a verbal intelligence and a quantitative intelligence. This has as its roots, you know, now your SAT verbal and quant, your GRE for verbal and quant score. Yes, it's the case that those two things are distinct abilities. Generally speaking, though, you know, I say this as psychology people, God has a great sense of humor. I celebrated my last math class in high school, first year of college, second year in college, graduate school. Whoops, have to take calculus again. Okay, got that out of the way. And, you know, and now here I am, I'm a quantitative psychologist doing math for a living. The funny thing about psychology majors is that we often say, oh, I hate math. That's why I'm in psychology, because I hate math. Oh, geez, the statistics class is terrible. But it's not the case that math is something you're born with. Your quantitative score on an ACT math test is something you can do something about. You can take a class, you can do the Kaplan courses, you can do Khan Academy. All of those things are excellent ideas for introducing, getting practice, and learning how to improve your math score. Your verbal score is a little harder to change. Generally speaking, interventions to improve verbal ability are most effective the younger you get. This is why casting a lot of bread upon the water, putting a lot of money out into early childhood education really pays a lot of dividends. You're not going to be able to change people's verbal ability scores too much in junior high. So she goes through a few examples of school achievement. And yeah, you could say, here's a self-report, here's the records, and here's teachers' observations. I talked a bit about the French school system where teacher observations depends on how you're dressed. And in school grades, well, we have a couple of problems going on with that operational definition, because first of all, before the grades are assigned, like on a TEQ, people say, yeah, I'm going to do okay. And it often comes as a rude surprise that, whoops, they didn't. Secondly, when people are asked to recall, they systematically over-recall their grades. And third, when you ask people their grades and their grades are low, they just not give you the information, just leave that item blank. So there are some problems with self-report that you might not realize. Checking records. Well, what could be better? Go on and get the registrar's information and pull the transcript. Also has its problems. First of all, registrar information is not designed to be a data source for research scientists. So very frequently, the information in the transcript may not be complete. It may be assigned arbitrarily. You don't know the conditions under which a grade gets assigned. Sometimes people will drop out. And as a result, they'll get a W or an F on something, but that's really because they stopped attending university more and didn't drop until well after the permissible time to drop. Do you want to count that kind of academic failure the same as the person who stayed in class and really tried their hardest? So each of these, yeah, you could make an argument there's school achievement going on, but they all have their own problems. Trying to do since I've kind of done this past year, trying to think about how psychology students at Mizzou perform is a complicated thing. Many of you came to Mizzou already with your intro psych class under your belts already, and several other classes. Some of you start here as a sophomore in your first year because of all the AP classes you've had. Therefore, it's a little bit hard to start making conclusions about grades that happen early in the psych major sequence and subsequent graduation. So things to think about here are, is this really the thing? I mean, is a school grade a measure of successful nutrition, or is it actual measure of performance? And is it contaminated by other variables? Are there other things going on? Beat the old horse about school achievement, a student performing in grade school, relying on many factors. For college students, I don't know how many of you are doing it, but an awful lot of you are working. Sometimes your classes conflict with the work schedule. Sometimes your work schedule conflicts with quarantining for COVID. Sometimes financial emergencies happen as a result of this, and you can't do your classes. Well, is this academic achievement? Is this something to do with your academic preparedness? But especially if we're thinking about first-generation college students, of which I are one, you don't walk in as a first-generation student and know kind of what the college thing is going on about. I just knew that you called them all professor. When I started college, I kind of thought they ran around in their robes on campus when they lectured. You see them in graduation, they're all getting dressed up like that, but they don't. And what can we know about our operational definition? Always important to think about. I'm looking at these numbers, but they're not really things to do. And the population that I'm looking at might not be one population, but actually have subpopulations. Past year, when I taught this, thinking critical about operational definitions was hard. So I got one of anybody got any observations or comments for the video? People kind of fast forward through, oh yeah, you did this study, you have your variables, and now we proceed to the rest of the analysis. Okay. When you're looking about, this is just a little slide of vocabulary. When you're looking at variables, there are some characteristics of them. Joke in research, variables won't, constants aren't. Well, if you're looking at a variable in a study, you have to have at least two levels. If everybody has only one value on it, it's not going to be something that you can look at because psychology is a study of variation. So you have to have at least two levels. And it's got to be something that we can observe and write down. In other words, it's a fancy way of tying it back to the idea of psychology being empirical. The variable can either be manipulated or observed. Sometimes I can manipulate the variable, sometimes I can only look at it. I can't assign you to a smoking and non-smoking group. It's not ethical. I can merely observe that. I can't assign you to being a twin or not. But I can observe that variable. And I can see how twins are related. Paradoxical fun fact, I was a twin as well, but the other guy didn't make it. And some language here is that variables can be nominal, ordered categorical, or they can be continuous. Well, nominal, that's easy. What color car do you drive? That's a nominal variable. Red is not less than orange. It's not less than yellow. So they're just four categories. In our perceptual world, we treat them as flavors. Variables can be ordered categories, though. So one way, in a survey questionnaire, you might have a 5-point Likert scale going on. And maybe the distance from 1 to 2 is not the same as the distance from 2 to 3 and 3 to 4. Or another one, on a given that I do alcohol, the number of drinks that you drink on a given night is probably ordered category. The difference from no drinks at all to one drink, and from one drink to two drinks, is probably significant. But some of our brethren and sisters of the congregation report saying, well, you know, I drank 20 drinks, and another one says I drank 19. The difference between 19 and 20 drinks in an evening is not that much. The level of intoxication is what we can ethically administer in a lab setting. This is interestingly why we do studies on 21st birthday. Not to spoil things, I don't think we have any studies going on. What we would do is say, oh, hey, do you want to come in and we'll have you do an MRI, and it just happens to be a month before your 21st birthday. And then we contact people after the 21st birthday and say, hey, you know, want to do another MRI? Well, by the way, do you kind of remember how much you drank on your 21st birthday? And we look for plaques, because as I mentioned before, there's a lot of alcohol going on there, and it's more than some of it life-threatening than we could administer. Thank God the drinking establishments of Columbia, Missouri short shot the students. You're not getting a full drink. Yeah.
There's actually a study they're trying to recruit people for between 18 and 21-year-olds who consume alcohol. You can make $300, $500 within the next 17 months.
Yeah.
It should be in your emails.
Is it a 21?
Yeah.
Is it a 21?
Oh, it's for people below the limit.
Yeah, they're recruiting.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do that. We're part of the precision medicine. So all of those variables, you know, nominal ones just have chunks to them. I can say, well, you know, does driving a blue car, like I do, lead to fewer accidents versus a red car, and so forth. If I'm looking at ordered categories, I can look at the differences between levels. But sometimes my variables are continuous. Okay. A little vocabulary here. Continuous variables are either ratio or they are interval. Well, you don't have to worry too much about fancy language here. Like we don't have my ruler here. A ratio level is a scale that has a meaningful 0 point. Height is a good example of a ratio scale for weight. You can have 0 of it on a scale. Measuring, say, how tall a corn stalk grows in the fields of Missouri, you just put your ruler in the ground and say, yeah, that's a 6 foot 5 inch stalk of corn. By contrast, and the measuring units, by the way, in the ratio scale are equally spaced. So the distance from 6 foot to 6 foot 1 inch is the same as the distance from 5 foot to 5 foot 1. An interval scale, by contrast, is a measure where there is no meaningful 0 point, but the spaces between the measuring points are equally spaced. So if I take a ruler and I break it, and turn a ratio scale into an interval scale. Oh, there's a little story I have here about this. Concerns my son, who is one of those children who never listens to what the parents say. And when he was about 3 years old and was writing a lecture at the time, he got a hold of my measuring tape. Pull the thing, press the button, and it snaps back. Pull the thing, snaps back. But Justin, stop doing that. It's not a toy. Yeah, Dad. Oh, it snaps back. Oh, it snaps back. Oh, crap. So I now have a measuring tape that starts at 15 inches. Well, what can I do with an interval scale I can do with a ratio scale? Well, I can still measure how long this table is with my broken measurement stick. It's just, and I can judge whether this table is longer than it is wide. I'm still going to get numbers out. We'll say this has, you know, 2 more feet on it than this distance. I can't, however, figure square footage unless I take into account the fact that my scale was broken. Most scales apart from physiological measurement, are interval level scales if they're continuous. Often, if we are doing a small study, a couple hundred people, we do our Likert 5-point scales and we treat those as if they are interval scales, even though, as I mentioned above, if you really think about it, they're probably more ordered categories. So if you're rating instruction, little secret for yourself, students are generally kind. When you're rating a class, you have to really be a gold-plated jerk to get a 1 on 5. Students will say, well, yeah, they showed up, they said something. It was not the absolute awfulest hell I've ever had. Therefore, maybe it's a 2 or a 3. It's hard to get numbers that are even below 3.5. On the other hand, it's really hard to get a 5 unless you're teaching sex, because it's an interesting topic. Everyone comes in relatively interested in learning about it. If you're teaching statistics, it's hard to say, well, my teaching is just as good as the sex class. So but yet we treat those things as if they are somehow interval. We have lots and lots of data. Statistical techniques exist where we can actually take into account the fact these are ordered categories. But that's a topic for graduate school. So when we're looking at, this is out of the book, when we're looking at thinking about our variables, what's our conceptual variable we're looking at? Expressing gratitude to a romantic partner. I'm going to have to come in now and do an operational definition of that. How often do you agree with items like I tell my partner often that they're the best? And then once I've agreed on that as an operational definition, I'm going to have to think about what are the levels of this variable. And at the end of the day, is this variable measured? Each of these has its own level of criticism. So I can criticize at the conceptual level. I can criticize these operational definitions. Is it the best way to measure gratitude to ask the person how often they self-report saying this? Maybe they think they're saying it all the time. Or maybe they think they're showing gratitude, but they're doing it nonverbal. Doing the laundry, doing the dishes. And your levels also need to be relatively carefully thought through. A couple of stories about levels. Sometimes people get in love with 5-point Likert scales. One of the graduate dissertations I was on had 5-point Likert scales, and some of the items were, how often have you drunk 5 or more drinks in a sitting? Why? And then how often have you shot or stabbed someone? Well, that variable is not going to have all that many levels. If you've done it once, that's enough. And it really isn't a great idea to do that. Any questions about that stuff? So be able to make these classifications, talk about whether you're measuring them or manipulating them. So this is one of the big topics that she makes a great deal of hay about. When you're looking at the claims, you can either be talking about a frequency claim, an association claim, or a causal claim in your data. Frequency claims are, relative examples of numbers. It's 2 to 4 alcohol today. Association claims are this appears to be related to that, and causal claims are this causes that. Now, we will talk. The reason that we make these distinctions is the data that are used for each of these types of claims is probably going to be more or less important depending on the case. If I walk out onto the mall and I asked our journalism people call Mott's interviews, man on the street, I'm not doing a systematic sample. So my frequency claim about how prevalent something isn't that impressive. If I'm going to make a sound frequency claim, I'm going to have to say, what is my population? And I really want to make sure I've sampled well from that population. Association claims are perhaps a little less contingent on having a really, really great sample going on. Ask a question in the population and say, does there appear to be some type of a correlation or some type of relationship between one variable and another? Causal claims are association ones, but I'm going to say this variable actually causes that. Well, in causal claims, it would be nice if you were able to manipulate the variable as opposed to just measure it. And the reason for that is random assignment enables us to rule out a bunch of other explanations for an association. The other type of data where causal claims are able to be made a bit more confidently has to do with genetic work. Members of a family, twins or triplets, that are reared together and reared apart. We assume that in some respects, the genetic information is the same, or at least it's shared across members of the family. Now, using behavior genetic techniques, we can assess what proportion of variation is due to your own unique abilities, just who you are, the shared environment, and the genetic information. I have to confess, when I first started looking at that kind of data when I came to Missouri, I was really, really leery of it. But we'll get more into how genetics people actually play the game against themselves. So the task for you at this point, when they describe a research study, you need to be able to put it into one of these three areas. And when we get to the criticisms part, be able to say, I don't like this frequency claim because, or maybe this association claim is not convincing because. Those three terms are. This slide you can kind of go through quickly. Frequency claims are just a variable. One measured variable. Association claims, you need at least two of them. Generally speaking, they're talking about correlations or covariation going on. The other type of association claim that she does not talk about in the book, won't be on the test, but keep it in mind is when we have two nominal variables, sometimes we can look at associations at one level of that variable versus another level of it. Those are really kind of local things. Correlations and covariations are generally used to describe interval and ratio level. Yeah, here's our example from Mizzou. So these are the data from men and women. And what we did was we looked at several semesters and we asked them, how many drinks did you have across the past 7 days? And then on the top and the women are on the bottom. So from this, we can see that on average on Friday, they're going out and consuming 4 to 5 drinks across. And that's the entire population. At least when I went to college, I also knew a number of people who were, abstinent, who waited to become legal. So there's an awful lot of alcohol. Unsurprisingly, Friday and Saturday are the heavy consumption nights, and Thursday is the beginning of that early weekend. Sunday less so. For the women, it's much less. Still elevated. That's again an average taken across the first, across all the people at Mizzou. It was a sample every year.
What are the numbers 1 through 8?
Those are the numbers of the semesters. So fall semester, spring semester, freshman year, fall semester, spring semester. So it went through freshman through senior. So that's we don't know how much alcohol you need to consume to hurt your brain. Lab literature is a little bit out there, but 5 or more drinks for men and 4 or more drinks for women is generally defined as a binge. So what we're saying is the average male student at Missouri binges. And that has been associated with a number of problems. That's an example of a frequency claim. The reason that this frequency claim probably is stronger than other research is we sampled everybody that was doing it. Sample of the population. Some people elected not to participate, but it was relatively few. And we know about the characteristics of people who elected not to. The ethnicity and the sex and the academic performance of people who elected not to participate. So I thought that'd be kind of interesting. Scatterplots are used for associations. Now, one of the weird things about teaching research methods at Mizzou is our curriculum is really, really broken up. And you took Stat 1200 or 1300, and then you marched over into this class. And very frequently, the thought is, gee, there's absolutely no relationship between what you have there and here, and therefore we should teach it all to you again. But you have had an exposure with a scatterplot is. We generally look at continuous rows when we're looking at it. And then my little mission to you is always look at your data with the scatterplot, because it tells you some information about the claim of the association. Often people will say, well, I'm going to get lost in all the statistics. I'm going to calculate the correlation coefficient and the significance level. And once that's done, thank you, I'm done, I'm out of here. And you can be really skeptical with the scatterplot. And you can really help you. Some words from Stat 1200, a positive association, the more of one variable, the more of the other one. A negative association, the more of one variable, less of the other one. And no association being there's no kind of association. If you want, it's kind of a good idea in your life to look at scatterplots and sort of say, well, gee, in terms of a scatterplot, what does that look like? And there's this nice website down here that you can log on to. It'll generate you a scatterplot and you guess the correlation, and it'll tell you what it is. And acquiring those eyes for thinking about what a correlation is a good thing for you to do. Because when you're looking at a scatterplot, you say, well, you know, that thing kind of looks like a 0.8 correlation to me. And then you look at the analysis and it says 0.5, and it's, something's weird here. You find that maybe there's a problem going on. When you're looking at a scatterplot, you're trying to decide what the shape of the association is. Remember that a scatterplot is the best fitting line that goes through the vertical points here. So you kind of squeeze all of these data points together and make a point, and squeeze all of these together and make a point. And that gives you some kind of idea about the level of the association. And a regression weight, a correlation coefficient, is the best fitting line through that in terms of the standard deviation of the square distance. What people will often do is they'll think, oh, gee, maybe I should draw a line here, and the distance between any line and where that line is what I'm looking at. And that's not true. It's always the vertical. So when you're looking at associations, you can make predictions. Sometimes an association claim is useful because I can predict. The stronger the association between two variables, the more accurate my prediction will be. So, and this varies as a function of psychology. One of the frustrations about the textbook for this class is she's from the area of social psychology. She often appears very happy if she has found a 0.3 or a 0.5 correlation. Says, oh, this is like the rock on which I can base my theory. Other areas of psychology, this is not true. If you're looking at alcohol research, we want to explain about half of the variance. And if you're in educational psychology, we want to explain about half of the variance. So generally speaking, we're looking for 0.7 correlations and higher to count those as something that's significant. That's not to put down social psychology. You're looking at a complex factor, complex association. So very frequently, your mileage varies. The correlations that make it in journals are generally a little bit lower. Predictions can be made based on positive and negative associations. You can't really predict too much. I think we'll pick this up on Wednesday. When you're reading an article, here are some words that are association claims. Here are some words